Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's great to be here with you all in person. And also hello to our virtual audience. We miss you, and hopefully next year we'll all be together. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sara Crowe, and I work at Polaris, which is a nonprofit focused on the issues of sex and labor trafficking. And I specifically work with the financial services industry to really understand the financial footprint of human trafficking and to partner with all of you to intervene on this issue. I've had the privilege of speaking at a number of ACAMS panels before as a panelist, but this is my first moderating gig, so everyone cross your fingers it goes well. I'm going to be channeling Kieran, and maybe I'll end up with my own podcast. We'll see how that goes. So despite my attempt at humor, we are here today to talk about a very serious issue of human trafficking, and I'm joined by some pretty serious experts on the subject. I'm going to introduce the panel in a moment, but before I do want to extend a thank you to ACAMS for your continued work and leadership in this space. You've done a tremendous amount to keep human trafficking on the agenda, to make sure it's prominently featured, from the bags here that are ethically sourced, slavery-free, very thoughtful about that. And as a member-driven organization, that also means a thank you to all of the ACAMS members for continuing to request this content, for continuing to show up. It's really because of all of you and your enthusiasm for this issue that I think we've made the progress we have in the last few years. I also want to highlight a project that I'm very proud of, that I've been working on for a while now. Let's hope that's up. And this was launched this week, actually. It's part 2 to ACAMS Human Trafficking Certification online module. So part 1 was a very kind of conceptual approach, overview of the issue. In part 2, we kind of take the opposite approach. We dive deep into 5 case studies that were human trafficking cases prosecuted in the United States. So these are real-life examples, and we really pull out the financial details from those cases, what was seen at different financial institutions, what were the red flags, what can be learned from these lessons. So I really encourage everyone to take it. It's with our partnership with ACAMS and the FAST initiative. It is free, and I think it's a very fascinating, I am biased, but it's an interesting a training, and I think it's a good opportunity to kind of familiarize yourself with the specifics of some of these cases. Each case study is about 10 to 15 minutes in length, so my recommendation is, split it up over a week, do a case, cover a case over your morning coffee or over lunch, and really think about them and how they might show up in your financial institution. They are quite diverse cases, so 4 of them relate to sex trafficking, 1 labor trafficking case, and they cover a range of financial products and services, so from retail and commercial bank accounts to merchant credit card accounts, mortgage services, cryptocurrency exchanges, crowdfunding platforms, you name it. I think we've tried to cover it. All right, enough of my infomercial. I want to move on to introduce the stars of the show, which is the experts we have here today. It's a very diverse group of experts, which I think is really important when we're talking about the issue of human trafficking, because it is a very complicated topic. It's a very diverse topic. It can manifest very differently, and we really need these different perspectives to truly get our minds around what's going on. So Bonnie Goldblatt is the head of investigations for Citibank's Global Financial Crimes and Intelligence Unit, where she oversees quite complex, wide-ranging investigations. Polaris has a great relationship with Citi and Bonnie's team at Citi, so really excited to see her here today. She is representing the financial services industry for us today, so it's kind of a big undertaking. But Bonnie is also formerly a federal agent at DHS, so she comes to us with varying perspectives. Next, we have Theresa Forbes, who is a senior policy advisor at the Department of Treasury, where she leads the department's efforts on human rights, corruption, and conservation crimes. I first met Theresa through her prior role at FinCEN, where she was really instrumental in a lot of FinCEN's human trafficking work. And finally, we have William Matchko, who is the lieutenant with the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. He currently serves in the Gang Vice Bureau, where he oversees both the Child Exploitation Task Force and the Southern Nevada Human Trafficking Task Force. So it's really exciting to have somebody who's kind of on the ground, in the weeds of this every day here with us. And so I'm gonna start with William. I think a huge challenge for anti-money laundering professionals generally is that the way criminals operate, is changing and evolving all the time, responding to changes in the environment. And we've certainly seen huge changes in the environment in the last year and a half. So I'd love to hear from you, from your perspective. How have you seen your human trafficking cases change and evolve, since the start of the pandemic?
So first, thank you for having me, appreciate it, and I'm honored to be here. Human trafficking is a very diverse crime, as is money laundering, financial related crimes. And one of the biggest problems we have as a police department and law enforcement nationwide, worldwide, is the more you look into it, the more you're gonna find. And it really is a game of cat and mouse, where the mouse is always trying to outsmart the cat, and whatever our tactics are, they're gonna look for different tactics. Here in Las Vegas and throughout Southern Nevada, we have various different human trafficking issues, and specifically, most of our focus is on sex trafficking, as you can imagine. We have the traditional people that are walking the streets and working in the prostitution industry, which is gonna be a lot of times your lower level pimps and panderers and sex traffickers, but a huge problem for us here is juvenile sex trafficking. And about 50% of our juvenile sex trafficking victims do come from Las Vegas, but the other 50% are being imported from other states throughout the United States. We don't see a lot of international cases. We do have a few, but most of them come through California. And that's dealing with your street level prostitution issues. But we also have a large problem with massage parlors, and massage parlors are an often overlooked part of the human trafficking and sex trafficking industry, where the victims of trafficking in massage parlors are not only victims of sex trafficking, but they're many times victims of labor trafficking as well. And with the international connections that you have in those massage parlors, you have very dynamic and intricate financial investigations that sometimes are very difficult for a local police department. And those investigations rely heavily on our federal partners, such as Homeland Security investigations, the FBI, and a lot of times the IRS, because they have so many international connections. You also have your strip clubs, which many times strip clubs are a front for human trafficking. And there's also and in Las Vegas, it's traditionally Hispanic brothels in neighborhoods. And Hispanic brothels in neighborhoods are a lot of times where we will find our international sex trafficking victims, where those victims will be brought in from another country with a promise of some kind of a good job or a lifestyle, and they'll be forced to work in a neighborhood brothel that oftentimes caters to the blue-collar worker in those neighborhoods. So for money laundering, one of our challenges is obviously the peer-to-peer applications on phones of paying these victims of sex trafficking, which are being intercepted by the traffickers, but also the trafficking that's going on in the massage parlors is a very complex investigation for us to deal with.
That's a great point. And have you, something that we've noticed through the National Human Trafficking Hotline and a lot of the work that my organization has done with PayPal as well is kind of an increased adoption of peer-to-peer payment options. I think that's probably across the board because of COVID, and there's been kind of a decrease in the use of cash. Is that something you've seen in your cases as well, a change there, or is it something that you've been seeing for a while?
I would say that with the advent mostly of, for some reason, and we talked about it before the panel, Cash App is very popular with our clientele. Why do I think that it is because it's very easy to get an account. It's very easy if you have a fake ID to create a fictitious account and lose the money trail through that app. There are other apps that are used, We have not seen a significant amount of the use of cryptocurrency in our cases yet. I know it's coming. Our colleagues throughout the nation have seen it, but most of our street level, lower end traffickers use Cash App not only because the pimps can intercept that, because if a John picks up a prostitute on the street, that can be, and she says, hey, send me $500 in Cash App, that money goes directly to the pimp, and the pimp doesn't have to deal with the prostitute or whoever he has, the trafficking victim, stealing from him, which is a continued concern from him taking the bottom line. One of the huge challenges is the movement of human trafficking to online platforms. Obviously there's issues with juveniles going onto having OnlyFans accounts and we had Backpage talked about a little here, but once Backpage got shut down, they moved to other websites such as Mega Personals, things like that, and we're continually trying to evolve to meet the demands of those challenges.
So William brings up a lot of good points, and Bonnie, I'm kind of curious from your perspective, from a financial institution, which of these have you guys been looking into? What are some things that you've been seeing related to maybe the use of online sexual exploitation or other types of typologies that are, kind of on top of your mind?
Well, certainly with the online, we've seen a lot of payment facilitators used to anonymize the charges. So after seeing the same ones again and again, we can readily identify those clients that we want to take a greater look at. So that's something that we absolutely see. We continue to see the traditional red flags that we've identified, specifically in the transportation sectors. That's something we tend to look at. And what we notice is either sometimes by the border, we see hotel charges and we see rental car charges. And then when you look at the client profile of their charge cards, their traditional charges are more related to high-end purchases, luxury items, and there's this inconsistency you see in these charge payments. So we look for that. Or sometimes we'll see charge cards where the owner of the bank card is charging Uber services in a jurisdiction totally in another area, an area where they don't live, they wouldn't frequent, to help the transportation of these services. We've even seen transportation services where we've seen excessive charges to local gas stations. And for a while, that we really didn't understand what it was until we spoke with our law enforcement partners. And apparently there are some networks that instead of utilizing hotels, they actually utilize a limousine for their services. And so they were just basically gassing up the limousine for the entire evening. So we tend to look at the transportation services, definitely something. Something else that we've identified, when I was in Homeland Security and we executed search warrants on different salons, nail salons, massage salons, and we're talking to some of the victims, we found out that the victims, if the networks own different facilities in different states, they would every month or so, they would move the victims to the different facilities because their clients want fresh blood. And so what we would see is we'd actually could track the movement of these vans through Easy Pass, through tolls, and through gas station purchases along the way. So transportation is something that we really hone in on.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I think has come up before, and something that I think we also need to continue to work to develop is kind of these known circuits where we're knowing that certain geographies are linked. So there might be a path that's something like LA to Las Vegas to, somewhere in Texas, like the Dallas area to Miami. William, is that something that you've noticed that Las Vegas is maybe a stop on a track, or are these people that are really based in Las Vegas? I guess with massage businesses, they're probably here more consistently, but do Do you have any insight into that?
With street level prostitution, there's definitely a circuit that runs through the United States. And I can tell you what we'll see here is a trafficker will bring his victims to Las Vegas, and they will work until they accumulate so many warrants. And once they have accumulated so many warrants that they know that the trafficking victim is going to get put in jail for an extended period of time, they'll usually move from here to Phoenix. And it depends on where they're going to work the circuit. They're either going to go back down toward Phoenix, or they're going to head down towards Los Angeles and then up to Oakland. So it's whichever way they're going to go on the track. And by the time they run the circuit through the United States back up the East Coast and back, a lot of those warrants, because a lot of times they're misdemeanor crimes, they'll just be forgotten, and no one will deal with them, and they'll start the circuit again, and it's a huge victimization. With the massage parlors, 100% agree. They do want new services at the massage parlors, so they will rotate the employees there continually, and those parlors, many of the owners own in various different states, exactly like Bonnie said, and they will just move them, and they will make the girls stay at the massage parlors and live on premises. Mm-hmm. And I've done multiple search warrants where we'll go in, and a lot of these women are living in prison cells in the back of massage parlors, or the house that's behind the massage parlors, they will buy that house, and it's a prison, and that's exactly what it is. That they're living in confined spaces, sometimes in cages, so that they cannot leave. And one of the saddest things is we've had situations where we've done search warrants on these places, and the victims of sex trafficking have just gotten off a plane from North Korea, and they'll say, "I don't care what it is that you do to me, I won't talk, because living in a cage here is better than living in North Korea," sadly.
Yeah, and that's something that's very common in a lot of sex trafficking situations, which I think really highlights the role of the financial industry here, because financial crimes is another avenue that can be pursued that can address these traffickers, really eat into their profits, and it's not going to be necessarily as reliant on victim participation if you can prove it through kind of documentary evidence. So just a great reminder of why this crime in particular is, I'm so excited to see that it was named as one of FinCEN's priority topics, because the financial services industry really does have a very unique role here. And I will also say that my organization has done a lot of research into illicit massage businesses. There's a good amount of information available online about illicit massage businesses and how they operate. It is not necessarily difficult to find very concerning information about massage businesses. So definitely if you are banking businesses that are involved in kind of the massage therapy industry, certainly there are many legitimate providers. But if you're researching those, look into how they advertise themselves. Are they advertising women in lingerie? That's not how a legitimate massage therapist advertise themselves. Can you see on some of the kind of sex buyer boards that they're talking about kind of the rotation schedule, or they're indicating that people are living on site? These are all things to be looking for that really elevates the risk of human trafficking. So Theresa, I want to turn to you. Treasury has obviously put out a lot of different guidance and resources on the topic of human trafficking. And I think it was just last week, maybe, that you guys published a notice about online sexual exploitation of children. I want to make sure everyone is aware of that document. Can you kind of walk us through it, and what are the key points there?
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you. I'm glad to really be here. When we're thinking of kind of trends and how the pandemic has changed things in this space, one of those areas is with the prevalence increasing with online child sexual exploitation, and also the payments of it. So between 2017 and 2020, through suspicious activity reporting, we have found that those SARs have increased that are related to online child sexual exploitation by 147%. So it's a significant increase, and we've seen because of the pandemic, it's increased even further. So what we did at Treasury was we put out an alert and guidance on for financial institutions for how to identify and understand what this is. We've put out previously advisories on human trafficking and red flags, and this is a particular subset of activity in which child sexual human trafficking is a subset of online child sexual exploitation. So we really wanted to understand that it's very different from human trafficking, but how there are linkages and how there are some overlaps and similarities. So what this alert does, it really defines the terms to help you understand the different types of offenses that are a part of this. There's child sexual exploitation, online child sexual exploitation, as well as child abuse materials, and helping you understand what are the differences between these things and what this phenomenon is, so that you can better report on it to drive up more effective reporting that law enforcement and other agencies can act upon. Within this document as well, it talks a little bit about kind of the trends that we've seen recently, and one of them of which that I want to highlight is sextortion, and this is a trend that's been increasing, particularly with the tween age as well as teens, where traffickers are and abusers are forcing these young minors to take sexual pictures of themselves, and what will happen is when they do that through the exploitation, they'll then be forced to pay or take more photos as they're using this as a tool and mechanism to kind of exploit them, or say, we'll post this and we'll tell someone about it unless you pay us, or take more photos. So it's this rampant thing as well that's happening, and a lot of it's happening online. A lot of the grooming for this is happening through social media platforms as well. So really trying to highlight all these different intricacies of the crime of exploitation and helping understand that. As was said earlier, human trafficking is a very diverse and dynamic subset of crimes, so really helping understand this one subset of it, as well as the use of the different types of payment systems that have been used for online child sexual exploitation. And what we've seen, as Bonnie mentioned earlier, there's been an increase in peer-to-peer payments that are being utilized, as well as virtual currencies to be used to pay for a lot of ads online, or to pay for access to some of the online child sexual abuse materials. And so we're seeing these types of payment methods being used for this particular crimes and set of issues more frequently than maybe with other forms of human trafficking that we're talking about here today. Another part and feature of this document, it talks about how do you report this information. And as I mentioned earlier, this is different and distinct, even though there are some overlaps with human trafficking. So one of the things that we're asking financial institutions to report is to use the key terms that's in the document. Unless there is a known child sex trafficking in there, that's when you have the opportunity to use the sex trafficking or human trafficking checkbox. But other than that, using the SAR narrative to really report on this type of activity and trying to drive more reporting in this area so law enforcement can use it. Also, because a lot of this activity is taking place online, and there's a lot of linkages with cyber crimes and cyber activities. And so there's a reference to FinCEN's former advisories and guidance on reporting cyber incidents, as well as a reference to the hotline for the National Child Exploitation Center to be able to report this information, if you hear about it, to law enforcement directly and quickly, and not just through the SAR reporting as required under your anti-money laundering obligations, but if you do know of a situation where a child is in immediate danger, you're able to report that to the appropriate law enforcement. And so I'll point out as well, the law enforcement that's looking at this issue, in many cases, can be very separate and distinct from law enforcement that's looking at human trafficking cases. And so that's why we want you guys to know and understand what this is, what it means, and how it intersects with the financial sector, as well as how to report it. I also want to highlight, too, Canada last year in 2020 also issued a similar advisory, and it goes into a lot of details. Canada is observing this and seeing the increase of this activity as well, and also has observe the same types of payment methods being used, like the peer-to-peer, as well as the virtual currencies. One thing that was interesting in the alert that Canada put out in their financial intelligence unit was that they're also seeing payments through MSBs, and they highlighted the top 10 jurisdictions of where payments were going to. The top 2 were the Philippines and Thailand, and within the top 10, the United States was one of them. So I want to highlight that as well, that this is not just a problem here in the US, it's a transnational issue, and I can imagine that there are a lot of linkages between the US and payments likely to the Philippines and Thailand as well, that Canada is observing and seeing. And in Canada's alert, they have a lot of detailed descriptions of potential indicators to look out for, which I imagine, and maybe Bonnie can talk to, it's probably similar to what the financial institutions are seeing here in the US.
So there's a lot to unpack there. I'm trying to decide which of these great points to follow up on. I do want to kind of give my 2 cents on the topic of crypto and its connection to human trafficking, because I think crypto is such a topic of this conference. So anyone who knows me has known that I've been, I don't want to say skeptical of crypto, but for a long time my view has been that the use of crypto and its connection to human trafficking has been a little bit overhyped. We're absolutely seeing it with the sale of child sexual abuse materials. That is the typology where it's shown up the most. We have also seen it for payment for escort ads online on the kind of back page replacement sites that William talked about. But that was really the extent of it. In the last year, I have observed kind of a shift in behavior around the way crypto is talked about in some circles. So for those of you who don't know, there are some individuals in the United States who self-identify as pimps. I'm not saying they're criminal masterminds, because they like to post a lot about their operations on social media. So obviously I monitor this chatter because it's a good source of intelligence. And I will say in the last year, I have noticed a significant increase in references to virtual currency. A lot of times as kind of like, seems like maybe money-making scams. It seems like get rich quick, a little bit too good to be true. But it does seem that these individuals are investing in crypto. I have also noticed that in cities where there is a very defined area where kind of like a red light district, or known as a track, I've noticed a huge number of Bitcoin ATMs located around that area. Now granted, these are areas that have a lot of crime generally, but it's something that I think we need to explore further. I'd love to connect with people in the crypto industry to talk about that specifically. Because while some of those ATMs are very compliant and are going to have great data, there are going to be other ATMs that don't have the strongest compliance. And how can we target those and really look into them? So that's my 2 cents on crypto, in case anyone was wondering. Bonnie, I want to turn to you because there's been a lot of discussion of the increase in financial fraud cases since the start of the pandemic. This is absolutely something that we have seen. Traffickers, are making money. They're from diverse activities, and we've seen a lot of financial fraud going on. Is this something that you have noticed? Are there any kind of case studies that we can learn from?
Sure. Certainly in the onset of COVID, financial exploitation spiked, and all the financial institutions were hit pretty hard. And we were looking at the various fraudulent schemes, a lot of the payroll protection plan schemes. One in particular involved a network of nail salons who applied for $13 million worth of payroll protection. And they went through 2 financial institutions and they received $9 million. What they were doing was they were actually claiming that they had more employees, they were falsifying tax documents, payroll documents, and they were actually claiming that single employees were working in multiple locations at the same time, which was impossible. And we had been referred to this case by law enforcement, and when we took a look, we then found some more unsettling activity. It turned out that one of the account holders was the subject of an indictment. And this nail salon network was involved in labor trafficking and human smuggling. And what they were doing was they were identifying victims, luring victims from Vietnam, flying them into the Mexican border, and then bringing them across the border to the United States, and then employing them in the nail salons. What they were doing is they asked them to claim asylum so they could stay here, and they were also housing them. When we took a deeper look into the transactional activity of these accounts, we identified the hotels by the border in Texas and in California. We identified the rental car charges. And then what was interesting was we found several charges to different power payments, like your rental bills. So it indicated that they were indeed paying for the power on several locations to house these individuals. And they ended up being convicted, these people. I think it was a Homeland Security case. And we did find the additional information with the information that was provided in the article. But that's something that we do find, is that there are multiple charges for utility bills in different locations, which could be an indication that they're housing multiple people in different locations. And this is something we see. Also, what's interesting is that they were applying for payroll protection. Well, these people were either not paying these people or paying them quite, low wages. But it just shows you, what their mindset is not only they're fraudulently cheating the government, but then they're also utilizing it to then commit, human smuggling, human trafficking, et cetera. So we just sort of backed into that one, and it's a shame.
William, have you seen kind of this nexus with financial fraud in your cases, or benefits fraud?
Here in Las Vegas, the estimates are that about half of our traffickers are also gang members. So when we're talking about that street level trafficker, those traffickers are criminals of opportunity. And when they see an opportunity, they're going to seize the opportunity, because most traffickers are also dealing drugs. Most traffickers are involved in all types of crime. So it would blow your minds how many times we would do we would see a pimp pick up a girl on one of the tracks. We would stop them and get a search warrant on the car, and 30, 40, 50 unemployment fraud cards in the car. And when you track this money, they were raking in hundreds of thousands of dollars, and also running trafficking victims out on the street. But in that crime of opportunity, I mean, we could watch it at any of our high-end luxury stores here. People that never had a job in their life are walking into any Italian luxury store and buying fur coats and jewelry and Maseratis and Lamborghinis, and I can tell you of multiple stops that I've seen where we've walked up, taken their cards away, and took $40,000 away from them, and they're like, don't care. Back in the day, before unemployment fraud, $40,000 was a mind-blowing amount of money, but they're like, don't worry about it. I'll re-up next week. And they're just going to go collect that unemployment fraud money again, get new cards, and go forward with it. And the backlog in the process of investigating this unemployment fraud is so log-jammed that it's difficult as law enforcement to keep up, no matter what. So yes, the combination of traffickers with that crime of opportunity is another challenge for us.
Something we've also heard a lot from survivor leaders is experiences of being forced to commit these different types of benefits fraud or financial fraud as one of the things that they were made to do, maybe in addition to prostitution, which means that the victim's identity is associated with this different financial activity. Theresa, can you kind of talk about the complexity there of, with human trafficking, particularly, at least in my experience on the sex trafficking side, a lot of the activity that is hitting a financial institution is actually happening within an account held by a victim versus the trafficker. Kind of, how do we think about that? What are the complexities and the questions that we need to be thinking about there?
First and foremost, I think it's very much happening, and we identified back in the first advisory on human trafficking about this, that unfortunately in many instances, the bank accounts where the suspicious activity was happening is in the name of the victim of human trafficking. And so what we tried to get and to warn about was, please report on the trafficker or the person who's benefiting from this bank account on the other end and not the victim, and to take more of that victim-centered approach, an informed approach when looking at this activity, because it does happen, unfortunately, in a lot of cases. It's happening where their bank account is being used in their name to then launder any of the illicit proceeds. As William said, it's also happening when trying to take out benefits in their name. It's also happening in a lot of cases where, when we're looking at forced labor that's being conducted in a business, sometimes that business, the name of the business has been taken out in the victim's or a victim's name. And what's resulting sometimes is a lot of tax implications. So we've been working with our partners at IRS as well to kind of help those victims where their trafficker is put in jail, they've been sentenced, and they have a tax bill, the victim has a tax bill in their name for a business that the trafficker was using to launder proceeds of the human trafficking. And so how to work with IRS on this, because it's not your traditional fraud case that was mentioned earlier. This is, and then it's in the victim's name. What do they do? How can they clear and restore their name? So also looking at how can we utilize our tools and approaches to be able to look at financial remedies and ways to help support survivors of human trafficking. One of the things I also want to mention, because it was talked about a lot in the first human trafficking panel as well, and was talked about today a little bit, is about how traffickers will take the documents, identity documents as well of their victims. And sometimes they'll even have fraudulent documents that they forged, maybe through bribes to customs officials in other countries. That happens a lot of times, to be able to get what looks like a legitimate work visa when it's really not. They'll take their identity documents or any types of documents that are theirs, and they'll use that as a form of exploitation for the victim of human trafficking. So they won't be able to escape, and when they do escape, they have no way to rebuild their lives again. They have no way to access, not even a financial institution, but access services and benefits that they're entitled to. They're unable to access, if they are now seeking other types of services, they can't get it because they can't prove who they are. They're also unable to be able to restore and live their lives. And in many cases where there is restitution that's awarded to the survivor of human trafficking, they have no way of accessing that financial payment either. So it's really important for us to think about new ways and approaches to be able to use our financial tools to be able to help address and remedy some of these other unintended consequences that happen through the victimization of a survivor of human trafficking. One of the ways that the Department of Treasury is doing that is supporting a risk-based approach to digital identity. And that's another way and a great use case of the importance and the role that digital ID can play in helping support survivors of human trafficking. It's also, I know, one of the pillars within the FAST initiative, too, that they're pushing globally throughout to be able to help survivors. At the end of the day, if they don't have that identity document, that's something that's theirs, they don't have control over it. So utilizing things like digital identity can help get a survivor of human trafficking control back over their lives. I think it's really important to look at this not just through how a bank account may be in a victim's name, and how can you, as a financial industry, be able to restore bank accounts and help them get access. And I know a lot of banks are participating in that initiative to help survivors regain access to their bank accounts that were being used to launder illicit proceeds. But then how can they also help access the financial system to be able to utilize all these different services when they don't have their identity document, which is very important for KYC and CDD? What can financial institutions do to help support survivors? And so there's a big global initiative on this. And I think it's really important that we're thinking through some innovative ways and approaches to help address and help support survivors of human trafficking as well. It's really important to look at our fight against human trafficking is not just about going after the traffickers, but also how we can help support those survivors or also vulnerable populations so they're not re-victimized again.
For those of you who are not familiar with it, I would really encourage you to look up the FAST initiative and the Survivor Inclusion Initiative that's part of that. I've been working on that with the FAST initiative for a couple of years now, and I think it's been one of my prouder moments is to have so many major financial institutions step up and agree to participate. Citi is one of the participating financial institutions, Wells Fargo's, Scotiabank, HSBC, all of these different large institutions that have said, we understand that this is a challenge for survivors, and let's see what we can do to make sure those individuals can get access to safe financial institutions. There's a lot of room within the regulatory guidelines where some of these accounts can be opened. Maybe it's looking at kind of alternative forms of identity, maybe going slightly outside of the normal process, but can happen and can really make a big difference in somebody's life. I know of a survivor who actually was supposed to start a new job, and that individual, the employer was requiring that she be paid through direct deposit. She didn't have a bank account. She was very kind of embarrassed and concerned about sharing with her employer the reason she didn't have a bank account. And I'll give credit to Rick Small of Truist, because I called him up and he got that account opened. Still complying with all of the regulatory guidelines, but just really making that extra effort for people who, that's going to change her life. She can start this new job. She has access to legitimate financial services. That's a big deal. Bonnie, I know Citi participates in this program. Was this, a challenge trying to figure this out internally? Kind of how did you navigate that?
It was so embraced by the bank. I think that the typical banker is so distant from the whole issue of human trafficking. And so it was really a learning experience and a teaching experience to the people, the business in the bank. And it was just embraced, and we actually had a formalized program. We put it together. We have dedicated personnel who will handle the onboarding because, there's special nuances and they have to, handle it right. But it was something that went all the way up to the board, and it was just something that we're really proud to be part of.
Okay, so we have a lot of great questions coming in. So we're getting some questions on OnlyFans. Are you seeing any traffickers using OnlyFans? Yes, that would be the answer to that question. No, I'm kidding. But yes, so our hotline saw a huge increase in reports of online sexual exploitation really right after the pandemic started. It's evened out a little bit more now, but OnlyFans and other similar platforms are absolutely being used to facilitate kind of the exploitation of trafficking victims, both minors and adults. I think that's an important thing to remember. We have had working groups with different financial institutions trying to figure out, okay, I see OnlyFans somebody is getting paid by OnlyFans. They're getting OnlyFans payments from Phoenix International, that's the company that owns OnlyFans. But how do I know if this is a consensual situation involving an adult, because people are absolutely making money off of it and deciding that that's what they want to do, and it is legal to participate in pornography, or is this a trafficking situation? And it's been challenging, I won't lie. I think I've heard of an interesting case study where somebody was getting payments from Phoenix International, and there was a second account holder, another person named on the account, who seemed to be unrelated to the primary account holder. Well, when they look into that secondary account holder, they realize that individual is on multiple bank accounts, all of which are receiving payments from Phoenix International, and all of the bank accounts are held by young women who would fit the demographic of people that are going to be most likely to appear on a platform like OnlyFans. So why is this secondary account holder on so many different accounts that are all making money from OnlyFans? So that's kind of an example of a type of situation that you might see. It is definitely challenging, as I think with all sex trafficking situations, to try and differentiate between, is this actually a sex trafficking situation, or is this somebody independently engaging in this activity without a third-party facilitator? And that's gonna always be, I think, a big challenge. William, I'm wondering if you've seen, platforms like OnlyFans or others show up more in your caseload recently.
So they have shown up, and one of the challenges in the cat and mouse game is, where is it happening, right? So for jurisdiction, how are we supposed to know where that IP address is originating out of? We have to wait on a warrant or something, an origination, to find out, submit the subpoena, get the return, figure out where the IP address is, and if that's a child, it's very difficult with those types of platforms to determine, well, I can see that casino in the background. This is obviously in Las Vegas. So that's a good tip for us, and it's so we can get the investigation rolling. But a lot of times it might not even be in the United States. And with adults, to be a victim of sex trafficking, you have to have that element of force, fraud, or coercion. And if you don't have that element, and it's an adult doing it to pay the bills because her boyfriend asked her to pay the rent, is it a trafficking investigation? And we have to make that determination, and those are very difficult questions, even if we do locate the victim. So the timeliness of locating the victim is a challenge. The actual location for jurisdiction is a challenge. And where we find most of our problems with it is if we find a juvenile victim of sex trafficking and in their interview they disclose their victimization, and sometimes they will let us know, yes, my trafficker forced me to set up an OnlyFans account, and here it is. And that's great evidence for us in our cases. But that's a rare occurrence, but it is happening more and more.
We're also getting some questions about, there was some will they, won't they drama regarding OnlyFans, announcing that OnlyFans would ban sexual content and then reversing that decision, and questions around, kind of what our stance is on that. I think I'm maybe the only person that's at liberty to share an opinion on this, so I'm going to do it. Look, my personal opinion is that, pornography is a legal industry, so I don't think that, it needs to be banned. But I think like any legal industry, it needs to be held to some standards and safeguards. There need to be certain, requirements put in place. You need to try and mitigate the risk of someone misusing your platform for exploitation, just like we would expect of other types of businesses. So my personal opinion is that we need to, I think, get stronger on what we think those acceptable standards are, knowing that technology changes quite frequently, and really hold these platforms to those standards. And if you don't meet those standards, then you don't have, the risk mitigation controls in place, then maybe you should not be operating. So that is my personal opinion. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts that they can share on this subject.
No opinion from the police department.
Okay. No comment. I don't think Citibank has an official opinion on this subject, or the Department of Treasury either. Okay, great. Okay, so I do want to take a moment to talk about labor trafficking because I think it doesn't always get the attention it deserves, partially because, let's be real, it's really hard to detect. You know, with sex trafficking, you're talking about situations where in most jurisdictions, the underlying activity is illegal, so you've already got proceeds from a crime. On labor trafficking, the underlying industry is legal, and a lot of their business and activity is going to be legitimate. So how do you go about determining which ones are exploiting workers and trafficking labor and which ones aren't? Theresa, I know this is a passion of yours. Can you talk to us about the Department of Treasury and kind of other resources that people should be looking into to understand labor trafficking?
Thanks. One of the recent things that the Department of Treasury did, along with Department of State, Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Commerce, and the Department of Justice, was to release a business advisory on forced labor. It really goes into a lot of detail about what's happening in the Xinjiang region of China and what's happening there in the prison camps, the forced labor camps, a lot of use of surveillance technology as well as human rights abuses. And it's a really great resource to be able to understand what forced labor is, and in particular to what's happening within this jurisdiction. However, there's a lot that can be learned and taken out of it as well, because forced labor is happening in similar fashion all across the world. In this business advisory pertaining to Xinjiang region, talks about the use of forced labor within cotton production. And that is not something that is just limited to the Xinjiang region. That's something that the Department of Labor has identified in many countries across the globe. The Department of Homeland Security's Customs and Border Patrol had put out a withhold release order, meaning that they had found that there was forced labor in importers' supply chain of cotton coming from Uzbekistan a couple years ago. So it really does go into a lot of depth about the different risks, as well as risks for the private sector in handling any types of products or proceeds related to these supply chains, as well as risks for investors as well. So it really goes into what is the financial due diligence requirements, because forced labor is a predicate offense. To money laundering, there is a significant role for the financial industry to play, both from the AML side, from the sanction side. This advisory talks about some of the enforcement actions that have taken, as I mentioned, the withhold release orders, as well as sanctions that have happened. So financial institutions have to look at that, but also financial institutions through their environmental social groups are looking at this issue and helping them understand risks, as well as their trade groups, because of these extensive supply chains, to where some of your customers can potentially be intermittently being utilized within a supply chain. And so helping understand what those supply chain risks are and what those obligations are for the private sector as a whole. I think that's a really important document, as well as the Department of Labor kind of puts out every year a list of goods that are produced with forced labor and child labor. So it talks about some of the similar things like within cotton supply chains, tomatoes that were coming out of China. It talks about all kinds of different industries and sectors. I think it's really important to help you understand some context and risks that are out there. In the United States, there's a lot within the agricultural space. Polaris in their report talks about that, so I think that's another really important resource. There's a new resource as well on looking at the fishing industry and the supply chains coming out of illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing. And a lot of these shipping vessels where the fish are being caught that can be used in coming into the US supply chains. There are many victims of forced labor on these shipping vessels, so there's a whole task force within the department various departments throughout the US government that are part of this task force. We put out a report to help you understand what are those risks within the phishing supply chains as well, some of the enforcement tools that we have to go after it, but really helping you understand this issue too. And then lastly, I'll mention there's a new Financial Action Task Force report that came out in June. It's really focused on environmental crimes, particularly illegal mining and illegal logging, and the intersections with money laundering, and the intersections with corruption and human rights abuses such as forced labor, as well as sexual exploitation that can happen. And so I really want to highlight too, within the illegal logging sector and illegal mining and in some of these precious metals, jewels, supply chains, there is a lot of human trafficking that's happening. So it really goes to show that human trafficking is certainly intermingled with money laundering, but also other types of predicate offenses that you all are looking at. It can make it a little more challenging to detect because of some of the financial indicators can be very similar with other types of activity, but it's because in a lot of cases, all of these different types of activities are intermingled together. So I think these reports that are public, that are out there, are really important to help you understand some of the risk and context in which financial institutions will be operating. So really good to read through those things, and particularly within the withhold release orders and findings, where a particular importer has a withhold release order action against them because the US government has found that that importer is in fact importing products made in whole or in part with forced labor, which is a criminal offense. And then also there are certain sometimes regions that are called out for their production. There have been gloves, rubber gloves made from Malaysia, for example. There's been tobacco from Malawi. So it really does help you understand some of these forced labor issues and how it really does intersect with a lot of different industries that you all may be coming in contact with through your own client relationships as well.
I'm really glad you call out the withhold release orders. I think that's maybe an underutilized data source for the financial services industry. Bonnie, we don't have a lot of time and there's only a couple of minutes left, but I know your team has done some really great work looking into forced labor of the Uyghur population. Can you kind of share any insights from that?
Yeah, I think that the Xinjiang Advisory is much more than a good read. It was chock full of really good information. They gave us buzzwords. They gave us names of companies with the orders. And we went and we data mined. We partnered with not only investigative groups, with the sanctions group, with our environmental groups, and we data mined utilizing that information to determine if we saw any transactions related to it. So I just can't tell you how appreciative we are of you putting together these advisories. We look at them, and if we can prevent this, we certainly will.
So I'm going to do a lightning round of kind of key takeaways. We've put together some key takeaways to consider. I'm going to ask everyone to kind of give maybe their top one or two things that you really want this audience to know or to consider. Mine's super easy. Take part 2 of the Human Trafficking Certificate online. It's a great resource. And it's free, so why not? Bonnie, how about you?
Public-private partnerships. I know these gals, we work together all the time. I'm only as good as the information that we're being fed. That's really important. And then data mine, be proactive. Don't let it come to you. Use those typologies and look for it in your institution.
I would say it's really important to have that survivor-informed, victim-centered approaches and remedies as you're looking at that. There have been a lot of financial institutions that have utilized survivors and survivor network groups to help with their training programs. It's really important to take that approach and other approaches that can help survivors of human trafficking, like looking at the use of digital ID and other types of initiatives for financial inclusion.
Human trafficking is modern-day slavery, and in an industrialized world, it shouldn't exist, but it preys upon our most vulnerable population. And yes, it is happening in China, it's happening across the world, but it's happening right down the street from where we're at right now, too, and it's happening in all of your cities. I'm not a financial crimes expert. However, if you are a financial crimes expert, you can be the one who takes this kind of training and identifies that victimization and brings it to the attention of law enforcement. And every person in this audience has the potential to get someone out of a life of imprisonment. And I don't think there's more of a worthwhile cause into educating yourself on these topics and being the one that gets someone out of slavery.
It's a great closing point. I know all of you have a lot on your plates, a lot of different things you're looking into, but this is one that I'm just so glad has been named as a FinCEN priority, and so glad that all of you have really invested your time and gone above and beyond to address this issue. We did include some more resources to be aware of related to the topic. It's available on the app too. There's a resource list there, so don't feel like you need to write down all of these URLs right now. I'm sorry for everyone. We got a lot of questions that we didn't get to, but obviously it's a complicated and diverse topic. I'm happy to discuss these questions with you anytime. I'm very available, so please do reach out. You want to hang out at the happy hour, and I will give you some of my thoughts on legalization of prostitution. I'm ready to do it. So thank you so much, everyone, and a big thank you to the panel for their amazing insights and expertise here.